Rent to rent, that might be something new to you, or you might not be fully aware of how it works. So in this video, I'm going to cover for you what rent to rent is, how it works, where it goes wrong, how to make it work, how to do the numbers, and how to basically run a proper rent to rent or a rent to SA business. So watch the video. This is quite detailed, but it's going to give you a lot of clarity. Is rent to rent a good strategy, and should you be looking at it in more detail? Let's explore. The first thing is, if you don't know what rent to rent is, let's clarify that for you. So somebody has a property, and that's the best I can do, by the way. So they own a property, and let's say they've got challenges in renting that property, or it's been empty, or they don't want the headache, they don't want to use letting agents because they've used them in the past, hasn't quite worked out well. So you go and say, I'll rent the property from you on a fixed rent, and I'll sign a 5-year lease with you, but I'll give you guaranteed rent for 5 years. And this person says, fantastic, exactly what I'm looking for, because I've got voids and I've got challenges, I don't want any of those. And you say, I'll do the repairs and maintenance too, for example. So you do a deal, you then find another person and you rent the property out to them on a rental basis. And how it usually works is, you will turn that property into an HMO. So you'll have a few people here, let's say times 2, so you got 4 people, could be 6 or 7 depending on the size of the property. And then you rent the property out and charge rent per month per room to these people. Pay this person the fixed rent. Let's say you're paying them £1,000, and over here you're making, let's say, £1,700. So you pay them 1,700 comes to you per month. Okay, over the year 8,400. You can then scale up. That's in a nutshell what rent to rent is. You're renting a property from somebody to rent it out to other people. So effectively, you kind of, in their eyes, become the landlord per se, and you're responsible for the property. Win-win. They're happy, they've got guaranteed rent. They're happy, they've got a place to stay in because they can't afford to rent a flat or a house because they only need a room. And you're happy because you've got cash coming in. You're keeping them happy, you're keeping them happy. So you're the deal maker, making it work for everybody else. So that, in a very, very brief nutshell, is what rent to rent is. So the other option for you is, rather than doing an HMO, you could do a single let, but then the landlord needs to take a lower rent, so you give them guaranteed rent, and then you need to make a margin. That isn't as popular because the cash flow isn't that great. But if the landlord insists, I don't want you to turn this into an HMO, but give me guaranteed rent, then you could work something out with the landlord, as long as they take a view on the fact that they're not going to get market rent. They're going to take less than market rent because you're going to charge market rent and make a margin. But most people don't do that. Most people usually explore the HMO route. A third option for you, which is again popular, which is rent to SA. So you take the property from said person, turn it into serviced accommodation, rent it per night as opposed to per month, and then get the cash flow coming in, pay them whatever you need to pay them to rent the property, and run it as a serviced accommodation business. And depending on how well you're doing, obviously the cash flow on that is going to be higher than an HMO, because on an HMO, let's just call it 4 rooms, just to keep it very simple. It could be more, by the way, but let's keep it simple. 4 rooms, and let's say you're charging £100 per week to each person. You got 4 people, you're charging £400 per week. Rent to SA, you can make a lot more than £400, depending on how many rooms you've got. Even if you've got 4 rooms, you can make more than £400 depending on the area that you're in and how busy you are. So rent to SA will create more cash flow for you than an HMO, as long as you're reasonably entrepreneurial, you got a good location, you market the property well, the property looks good, and obviously you've got to do all of that work in between to make it a very marketable and attractive proposition. And rent to SA is very popular and works incredibly well. And if you've got access to people who've got property, and some of the deals don't work for you, by the way, because you've scaled to a certain size, you've got a particular demographic or a particular proposition that applies to you, and people are feeding properties into you because you've got a good reputation in the marketplace. If deals don't work for you, what you can do is pass them on to new operators. So you know somebody else who's just started rent to rent or rent to SA, and they're looking for deals. You could say to this person here, I've got somebody else you can go to, and you can charge that person some kind of commission to introduce some of the leads to them. That's a bonus for you. So you still create some cash, but not as much cash because the deal doesn't work for you, but you're helping somebody else out, and in between you're making some money for having a good network and connections. Let's explore some of the benefits. So the first one is you don't need a mortgage because this person has a mortgage, and let's just assume that mortgage qualifies for HMO or for rent to SA. So you don't need a mortgage. You might have bad credit, you might not have a deposit to buy a property, there may be some other issues which preclude you or stop you from buying property. So the beautiful concept of rent to rent is the outlay in capital, apart from obviously fixing up the property and getting it to the standard you want it to get to. You don't have to have the outlay of buying a property, paying legal fees, paying stamp duty, land tax, and everything else that comes with it in terms of surveys, etc., and a deposit, because that's what this person here does. So minimal outlay for a good cash flow is a fantastic reason to get into SA and into SA or rent to rent. And a lot of people want to get into property, they just don't have the capital because it's tied up somewhere, or they don't have the savings. So rent to rent and rent to SA is a good way to enter the market. Another benefit is obviously once you can scale up and you've got a few HMOs, for example, or a few service accommodation units. If you're working full-time or part-time, you can now afford to leave your job because you're generating enough cash and income to be able to spend more time on your property business, which means rather if you've got, let's say, 4 units, if you leave work, you may now be able to manage 8, 10, 12 units, which creates more cash flow for you, helps you build a bigger reputation, and most importantly, you can then think of scaling up even more and start employing people who can look after the properties for you. So you've got your own team, and therefore you can grow even quicker and bigger depending on your own level of enthusiasm and ambition. And I think that's a big reason, because a lot of people are working, they don't like their job, or they don't like what they're doing, or they don't like the circumstances, they don't like their pay. There's 101 different reasons, or they just had a baby and they want to spend time with their child. A whole host of reasons why people aren't happy where they're working, or they don't like the commute or the travel. This here, you can work locally and you really become a business owner and an entrepreneur, depending on how quickly and how big you want to scale your business. So the possibilities are numerous. And remember, once you get into rent to rent or rent to SA, you're now part of the property world. That opens up other opportunities for you to look at other strategies, which means you now can diversify your portfolio and your business strategy. So let's look at the flip side. And one of the main flip sides is, because you've taken the property, you are now responsible to look after that property. So if you've got rooms empty, you're responsible for the voids. If there's maintenance work to do on the property, you are responsible for that. If there are bills to pay, you are responsible for that. So just don't do the basic maths, because I've seen in a lot of businesses, what people do is they do the basic numbers. For example, I'm involved in the children's day nursery sector, and people work out, well, you get paid, let's say, £200 per week per child, okay? So, and this setting has a capacity for 100 children. So they do 100 times 200 equals X amount. Well, I'm going to be making all this money here, and I'm only paying my staff X amount, whatever that figure might be, and rent rates, whatever else. Therefore, I'm making a huge margin here. What they don't understand is you never have 100% occupancy. You have bills you haven't thought about. You've got costs that you don't know about. Then you've got other issues like managing staff and doing 101 different things that you haven't fully thought about. So don't do this as a basic back of a cigarette packet calculation in terms of, I'm going to make £100 per room times 4 rooms. How if I make that into 6 rooms? Okay, £600 per week. I'm only paying this person over here £1,000. Over here, I'm making £600 a week times 4 weeks, to keep it simple. I know there's not 4 weeks in a month because it doesn't work like that, but keep it simple. So I'm making 2,400. I'm paying out 1,000. I've got £1,400 left. Even if I've got to pay some of the bills some of the time, I'm still well off. It doesn't quite work like that. So you've got to stress test it, thinking, what if I've got 90% occupancy, 80% occupancy? What if there's more repairs and maintenance to do that I haven't thought about? So do that stress testing to know exactly where you are, and look at the worst case scenario, because if the worst case scenario works, then it's a good deal. People unfortunately live in hope, and which is a good thing, by the way, but live in hope alone, and look at the best case scenario. And as we know from experience, the best case scenario isn't how things always work. So plan for the worst, or think about the worst, and then hope for the best, and you'll land somewhere in between and things will work out for you. Another thing to think about is, although you're creating a good business, you can scale up, and at some point you can of course sell that business. So you are creating equity in your business, whether it's rent to rent or rent to SA, because you're creating cash flow. But the capital appreciation in terms of the property itself all goes to the landlord. So you're not going to get that. If you've had that property with the landlord for 5 years or 10 years, they decide to sell it, the new buyer, by the way, might not want to do rent to rent or rent to SA, so you may lose them as a client or a customer, depending on what you want to call them. But worse still, just because you've had this property for 5 years with the landlord and you've been really good to them, when they sell it, they're not going to share the capital appreciation over the last 5 years with you, because that's their investment. It was their outlay when they paid the deposit, and it's their property. So you're going to get no capital appreciation in the property. What you are going to get is some value for the business that you create. So bear that in mind. And with that, you might want to think about buying some of your own properties from the profit you make. So you've got two things going on now. One is rent to rent or rent to SA, and the other one is your own properties where you're creating monthly cash flow and capital appreciation. So you've got a bit of both going on in the future. The final thing on that is, you don't have 100% control. Depends how tightly worded your agreement is. But if the landlord doesn't pay the mortgage, what's the recourse for that? The landlord wants to sell the property halfway through, what's the recourse for that? You need to have a proper legally binding agreement. So pay a solicitor, a commercial solicitor, to draft up a good commercial agreement for you, where you've mitigated and covered all the risks, so that you've got as much control as you need to look after the property and manage it with minimum hindrance. The last thing you want is to spend 20 grand on a property, get it fit for purpose, create 4, 5, 6, 7 rooms, however many rooms there are, and after 2 years the landlord says, I don't like this arrangement because I've just figured out you're making £2,400 a month, you're giving me £1,000, I'd rather make that money directly. You know, some people get that idea, they connect the dots, and after a while they forget about all the pain that they've gone through, they forget about all the money that you've invested in the property, they just want to see all the jam. And you need to make sure you're protected, to have a good legal agreement that protects you from the downside and protects you from all the risks, or at least mitigates them as far as possible. And with that, it's important in your agreement, and you make it very clear to the landlord what you intend to do. Because the last thing you want is turn it into an HMO, and the landlord says, well, my mortgage doesn't cover that. You turn it into rent to SA, and the landlord says, my mortgage doesn't cover that, or they're just not happy with that particular arrangement. So don't try and be too smart and think, I just want to pay you guaranteed rent, I'm going to turn it into an HMO or rent to SA, I'm not going to tell you about it. If the landlord will find out about it later, they might not be happy with it for a number of different reasons. So be upfront, tell them exactly what you're going to do, and they should be happy with the model, because they're getting a fixed rent, and they're usually, like I said, they're usually in a kind of a bad place or in an unhappy place where they've got a property which isn't working for them. You're giving them guaranteed rent, probably more than market rent that they've been getting in the past, so they should be comfortable with it. But make sure you make that clear, because if you don't, and you kind of illegally sublet the property without their knowledge, they're going to be an unhappy bunny. And if it's not in the agreement either, then they'll take the property away from you. You're going to have a problem. So be upfront, be straight, tell them exactly what you're doing, and if someone's not comfortable with it, I would say move on to the next person, because there are lots of people up and down the country who are comfortable with this particular scenario. So just be open and transparent. It's the best way to do business. So if you're looking to get into rent to rent, the first thing obviously is market yourself, have a website. When you're out and about networking, tell people about it, tell family and friends, tell people who you know who own property what you do. But above and beyond that, start talking to estate agents. They are selling properties for people. Those people want to rent out their properties. So estate agents could say, I know Dave over here, or I know Daniela over here, and he or she do rent to rent. So if you give your property to them, they'll give you guaranteed rent for, let's say, 5 years. Talk to them. So that could be a good lead generator for you. You can of course pay some commission to an estate agency for the referral. That's all above board and legal, and obviously thank them for the referral. So that could be a good way of you doing business. Alongside that, you could maybe use some letting agents. So let's, for example, assume that you have a good contact with a letting agent, they were looking after this property. This person isn't quite happy with that particular arrangement. They've not fallen out, but they think this doesn't quite work for me. I want guaranteed rent. That agent says, I don't do guaranteed rent, but I've got a friend of mine over here who does do it. They might be willing to introduce you to this person here where you can do the deal. Now, not all letting agents will want to do that because they're in the business of letting property, but if you know them well enough and they don't offer guaranteed rent, they might be willing to share some of their clients or leads with you who are unhappy with that particular arrangement. So that's another in for you, another avenue for you to get more properties. One big thing right now is social media. So market yourself on social media, be it Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, Snapchat, and all the other endless channels, or they seem like they are endless channels that we seem to have right now, is on there. Make sure you have a consistent and congruent brand in terms of rent to rent. Give people advice, give them information, share with them what you do, and over time you'll start getting people who are interested in what you do, because if you serve people by giving value and information, inevitably they'll come back to you because they say, I want somebody to do all this for me. I can't do it. You clearly know what you're doing because you're sharing so much information. Can you do it for me? And that's a good way to get in. And social media obviously takes time in terms of your own effort and energy, and you need a bit of kit, but you can do stuff on your phone nowadays. By the way, you don't need expensive kit to do that, and just share information. With that, my favorite by far is direct mail. So you can have targeted direct mail campaigns, which don't have to be that expensive, by the way. I don't suggest you write the copy yourself. So I'm into copywriting. I know what skill and art is required to be a good copywriter. So I'd say pay somebody to craft and draft a good sales letter for you, which you can post out to people, building a nice story, having a nice offer, having a nice call to action, explaining why they should work with you, and you can hand deliver them if you don't have the money to use Royal Mail or another postage company. Send out a lot of pieces. Remember, the response rate is very, very low. It might be 0.5%, 1%, possibly 2% if you got really good copy and a really good irresistible offer. So don't expect that if you're mailing out 2,000 pieces that you only 1 or 2 or 3 people respond, because the response rate can be very low. But if you do enough of it and do it consistently as you're building your brand, direct mail definitely works. It's been working for many, many, many years, over a century, if not more. And it's going to carry on working because it's a nice communication. There's less stuff coming through the post now, more coming through digital forms and social media. So when some people receive a letter, they're more likely to read it. And if it's engaging, good headline, good sub-headline, good text, they will read it and you'll get some leads through it. And then of course, with social media, you've got pay-per-click, so whether it's Google, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, all the other platforms do pay-per-click. Pay-per-click's not straightforward, so I'd say outsource that to somebody who knows what they're doing. You can do it yourself, by the way, but you're gonna make mistakes and you probably won't get the best results. So it could be worth paying somebody to do those for you and having targeted campaigns using lookalike audiences if you know what the kind of audience you've got and you've got a database, and try that. That works incredibly well. With that, have videos, free reports, information, whatever you've got, get more information out there and use pay-per-click, because that's going to enable you to get to more people a lot quicker. But again, you need some cash and you need a budget. If you haven't got that, then just use the basic method of networking, getting the word out there, word of mouth, referrals, and obviously networking and talking to people. And then possibly some direct mail if you've got a bit of cash, and using your own social media profiles and channels to get the word out there. So when you're looking at rent to rent, the first thing you want to work out is there demand in that particular area for the kind of demographic you're looking for in terms of tenants. So you need to do the research, you need to get to know the area well and work out the demand. Because the last thing you want is to enter into an agreement and then find out you're in the wrong area for rent to rent, because it's not the type of area that lends itself to it. So if you've got, say, a hospital in that area and you've got nurses or other hospital staff living in that area, it might work well there. If you've got a university in the area, it might work well there. But so you need to work out the demographic of the area, so you find the right area where rent to rent works. It doesn't work in any and every area. I can assure you that, because I've got clients who are running some significant and substantial rent to rent businesses, and they're not investing or doing deals in every single area. They pick and choose where there's demand. So make sure there's demand, otherwise choose a different area. Secondly, work out in terms of demand, how much you can charge in terms of per room. Because the last thing you want is enter a deal on a fixed rate, especially if you're new, you're enthusiastic, you might end up paying more rent than you ought to on your first 1 or 2 deals, and then find out the rent over here doesn't stack up. Using the earlier example of children's day nurseries, just saying £200 per child or £250 per child times 100, you might have done that calculation here, but you soon find out it's not, the rent per room is a lot less than what you thought it would be, and you're stuck in an arrangement, and then you're snookered pretty much. So take your time, do your research, make sure there's demand there, and make sure the rental figures tie up. If the rental figures don't tie up, find a different property. There's no pressure, there's no need for you to do a deal that doesn't work. You want to do a deal that works for you and works for your tenants and works for the property owner. If it doesn't work, move away. I assure you there's plenty of deals out there. So once you've figured out the rental income, then you want to work out how much profit you're going to make every single week and month. Like I said, do a stress test in a worst case scenario, but with that, work out the payback period. Because if you're spending, let's say, 10 grand on a property and you're making £500 per month, okay, work out how many months it's going to take you to get that money back. But if you're spending 25 grand on a property and you only got a 2-year lease, you're probably not going to make the money back. So work out the payback period and make sure the agreement you sign with this person here for the number of years is sufficient for you to get all your money back for the outlay, plus the time and effort that you're going to run or use to run that business over 5 years. So make sure all that's accounted for, because the last thing you want is to get to year 5 or however many years there may be in the agreement to work out, well, I've got my initial outlay back, but in terms of profit, I've only made £1,500 over 5 years. It's a bad place to be. That's not a good business model, and you don't need me to tell you that, by the way. You should be able to figure out that out yourself. So make sure you do the numbers, make sure the profit margins are there, and make sure the payback period works. And you should really get to payback, I'd say, by the end of year 2 in terms of the initial outlay. Then year 3, 4 and 5 should be pure profit for you, less repairs and maintenance and other costs. If it doesn't work like that, I wouldn't want to do the deal. Your circumstances and situation may be different, so you might think 2.5, 3 year paybacks are okay. Anything more than 3, I don't think works, but you make that choice. You're a grown up, you know how to run a business. So I think rent-to-rent's fantastic. Just so you know, I don't do a rent-to-rent business. As you know, I do commercial conversions, I do new builds. That's the business I'm in. I've got a lot of clients who have deployed different property strategies. Rent-to-rent is one of them. Just so you know, I don't do this myself, but I wanted to share it with you because it's a possible strategy, and I talk about property, and it would be remiss of me not to talk about rent to rent. I think it's a fantastic property. I think it's good cash flow, whether you're doing rent to rent in terms of an HMO or rent to SA, it works incredibly well. But do the numbers, make sure the agreement ties up, make sure the landlord knows what they're doing, make sure you invest in the right area, make sure the rent ties up, make sure you're clear on the payback, and have all those things in order. Don't just do your first deal because you're desperate to do it, because you'll get your fingers burnt. But if you follow the method and the model as you should do, you're going to do incredibly well, and it's going to serve you really well.